So Tameika Shaw is manager, primary healthcare services with Taibu Community Health Center in Scarborough, Ontario, with the goal of improving health outcomes of individuals and community. Tameika co-leads client initiatives aimed at improving patient access to care, building organization capacity, and fostering external partnerships. One, of course, is with the Walnut Foundation. So leveraging her experience in health leadership and project management, Tameika also serves as clinical lead for the center's COVID-19 pandemic response, which includes testing, immunization, health education, digital health, and patient safety initiatives. With a career as a community dietitian spanning over 14 years, Tameika continues to provide counseling on a wide range of diet-related conditions, plan and deliver evidence-based programs, and work with various community agencies to address food insecurity. Tameika obtained her Bachelor of Applied Science in Nutrition and Food at Ryerson University and holds a graduate degree in Health Sciences from the U of T. She's a member of the College of Dietitians of Ontario, Community Health Center Dietitian Action Group, and sits on the board of the Primary Care Dietitians Association. Please join me in welcoming Tameika Shaw. Over to you, Tameika.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for actually inviting me, Ken. The Walnut Foundation, as you mentioned, we've had various connections and partnerships throughout the years. So I am happy to be here to build on this important topic and to, of course, build on what Dr. Natu and what Paulette spoke about earlier. And I heard or saw that there were some questions in the chat around nutrition. So hopefully my presentation will cover that. If I do speak too quickly, or if you need me to clarify something, then please, put it in the chat, and hopefully one of the moderators can ask me to repeat or to elaborate. Dr. Natu and Paulette did go over most of the physiology stuff and the function with regards to kidney and kidney health, and I'm just going to build on that. I will do a quick overview of some of the pieces, so it will seem repetitive a bit, but I just need to focus on where kidney function changes and then the actual impact that diet would have. General disclaimer, though, is that the advice that I am giving is with regards to stage 1 to stage 5 and not really very relevant to anyone who's on dialysis. It could be relevant for people who have had a functional transplant, as they've spoken about transplant as being one of the intervention. But reason for not being focused on anyone with dialysis is because kidney diet is individualized. It does get even more individualized the more interventions that are involved, or the more advanced stages of the disease. And as a community dietitian, it means that I do not see anyone who's on dialysis, because that person would be seen by a renal dietitian in a renal clinic in the hospital. So somebody working more closely with Paulette, for example. And if I could have permission to share my screen, can I do that?
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right, and I'm hoping you're not going to hear too much of the clicking of my keys while I'm advancing my slides. So I'm speaking specifically to diet on kidney health, and like I mentioned, most of my advice is really applicable to the early stages. So I'm very much looking at prevention, right? So even preventing and maintaining good kidney health, and then even if you start to get into moderate levels of kidney disease, my advice would still be relevant. Then towards that stage 4, stage 5, it's usually a partnership or collaboration between the dietitian and the nephrologist, dietitian and family doctor, nurse practitioner to monitor and adjust under clinical supervision people's dietary intake, because now we start to get into monitoring blood levels of certain nutrients. So that being said, I'm going to jump right in. Outline of my presentation will involve, like I said, very high level overview of the kidneys, overview of kidney function and health. Dr. Natu went into that into great detail. So I'm just more connecting the dots of where kidney function starts to affect the reasons for change in diet. We'll talk about some nutrients of concern. There can be quite a few, but they're usually the typical 4 or 5 that get mentioned, and I'll speak specifically to those in relation to the stage of the disease. I'll go over general dietary recommendations and what that might mean, and hopefully for the people who are on the call, you'll be able to take a few notes or one or two pointers that you can actually apply to your own life. There won't be space to share, again, individual recommendations, if you will, but dietitians at Taibu, there is no cost to see a dietitian at Taibu. You can reach out and you can be booked a virtual visit, in-person visit, phone consult, whatever is convenient for you, if you actually feel that you need more individualized advice than what I'm giving in terms of my general recommendations. I will touch on some other considerations like reading food labels, because that's important to kidney health. And then I'll touch briefly on managing other conditions. And again, Dr. Natu mentioned those, so diabetes and hypertension specifically, and anything else such as supplements, fiber, and we'll get to the end. And again, if I haven't addressed anything that you think you have a burning question on and I'm able to answer it, then please reach out. If it's related to the dialysis, as I mentioned, I may not be able to get into the specifics of it, again, just because of the nature of where I work and the population that I work with. So general function has been said before. The kidney functions to cleanse and to filter your blood of waste and toxins. Why this is important in terms of diet is waste is produced during digestion. It's produced from the metabolism of certain foods or nutrients that you take in. So protein is an example. So protein or animal foods, that is a source of protein. The digestion of protein produces waste. So that's one importance. Getting rid of waste through urine, that's connected to your fluid intake. And of course, again, digestion. Regulating the amount of water in your body, connected to fluid intake. And then it helps with balancing minerals like calcium and sodium and potassium, which are all nutrients that are found within foods. And of course, kidneys are responsible for secreting certain hormones. One of them that Dr. Natu had mentioned, I don't know if folks remember, but he mentioned something called erythropoietin that is involved in red blood cells production. And so not enough red blood cells can lead to anemia. So that can be a concern. Another piece that was mentioned was being able to convert vitamin D to active vitamin D. So vitamin D in foods is usually inactive, and your kidneys need help, or it needs help to be converted to the active form that is being used. So again, if kidney function is affected, then vitamin D status is one that can be affected. So kidney disease, again, occurs when there is any issue with regards to function, whether it's a congenital function, like you're born with it, or any effect on the function of the kidney related to diet and to lifestyle. Testing is really the best way to tell how well your kidneys are working. As you've heard before, in the early stages of the disease, most people have 0 symptoms. So people are walking around feeling very healthy, but not realizing that the health of their kidneys are declining. So certain risk factors can definitely put you at risk. What I've listed on the screen are the ones that I call modifiable risk factors, or ones that you have a little bit more control over. So having chronic illnesses like diabetes and hypertension, which are both related to diet or can be managed by diet somewhat. Having a family history of kidney failure, having heart disease. Body weight can play a role in some individuals. And I know Paulette had mentioned that I may speak to BMI. I actually won't speak to it because for me, BMI is a bit controversial, especially in our population. But at the same time, it's not always 100% accurate or an indicator of someone's health. So I usually say, let's leave it to individuals to determine if they're concerned about their body weight, and to speak to a provider one-on-one to see if body weight at that point can play a role in managing any of the pre-existing illnesses, such as hypertension or diabetes. My main focus in terms of body weight is more around behaviors versus a number on a scale. So behaviors that are more actionable, something such as your physical activity level, for example, or the foods that you take in, or how you manage stress, your sleep, water intake. Those are actual actionable goals and outcome versus having a number on the scale as an outcome. So any of these existing for you, and if you have any conditions or concerns here, of course, check with your provider about the frequency of testing. So in one of the earlier questions was around how often should how often should your blood be tested for GFR, for the filtration rate, or how often would they do a urinalysis? And so if this is something that's of concern to you, for some folks, we do recommend twice per year, so every 6 months. And to me, that's something that you want to follow with your family doctor, at least make sure it's being done. Sometimes it's being done and it's on the lab report, but most of us do not request the copies of those lab reports. So as mentioned before, kidney disease is diagnosed using blood test and also urinalysis. And so I'm showing a quick graphic that I took from a website. It's basically showing the same scale with regards to the stages. So anything below 15, which is in the red, symbolizes kidney failure. So anything 15 or less shows that you're really in an advanced stage of the disease. Anything 15 to 60 would be considered moderate to severe CKD. And then anything over that 60 is normal, as Dr. Natu had mentioned. Now, for most of us, we really want to stay normal. And the advice I'm giving next is very much applicable to all of this. Are you just seeing the slides? I just need to do a quick check.
Yeah, we're seeing the slides.
But you're not seeing the video of everybody else. Like I'm not. You're just seeing my full slides.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So I'm just going to recap just to make sure I cover. So between 60 to that 120 mark would be considered normal. We want to preserve function above that 60 as much as we can. And of course, if we do happen to fall below 60, again, we're now working towards slowing the progression of the disease. And so as you can see, early detection of any decline in function is going to be very key to making sure that you're able to manage and prevent any additional damage. That's when you start to want to make even more intentional changes. So again, 5 stages listed here. Stage 1 would be considered normal. Stage 2 is still considered somewhat mild. At this stage, your kidneys will still continue to work as well. You won't have any symptoms, so you just might not be aware that your numbers are declining. Stage 3 to 5 would be considered more moderate to severe CKD. So at this stage, your body is less able to get rid of waste and water, and more advanced stages, so stage 4 and 5, you'll start, or you may start to experience symptoms, some of the symptoms listed. And as the kidneys continue to lose function, that's where you start to make the medical decisions with your family doctor as to whether or not you would be qualifying for dialysis and the various types, or whether or not you would qualify for a transplant or any other medical management. So our primary goal in nutrition recommendations, like I said, preventing kidney disease from the number 1. So we're always doing lifestyle changes. Every single adult can engage in the physical activity, eating well, taking in less salt, eating more fruits and vegetables, all the various healthy dietary eating patterns that would help us to prevent chronic conditions and help us to prevent kidney disease. Then between the certain stages, you're trying to maintain your kidneys for as long as you can and just preventing any further damage. So stage 2, your goal is maintaining kidney function. Again, at this stage, your body is still able to get rid of waste. You do not have any symptoms. Then you had stage 3, stage 3A and B, that's considered moderate. Your goal is to slow the progression of the disease. At this stage, your body is less able to get rid of extra water and waste, and so you might need to start making some changes to the foods you eat. Stage 4 and 5 would be considered severe. Again, goal is always to slow progression of the disease, but now you're also managing symptoms. So you're managing symptoms like your appetite, which was mentioned. You're managing symptoms like swelling or edema in your feet. And then you're also treating malnutrition and what we call wasting or protein energy wasting. So if your appetite is low, then chances are the actual amount of food that you're taking in is low. And that will lead to malnutrition or and can lead to muscle loss, which is called catabolism, can lead to wasting. Any dietary changes here, though, become even more individualized, and now you're having your blood work monitored routinely for certain parameters. So you're having your blood work monitored for phosphate levels, for potassium levels, just to make sure that your diet can be adjusted. If it's too low, then you're increasing potassium-rich foods. If it's too high, then you're decreasing potassium-rich foods. If your phosphate levels are too high, you're decreasing phosphate or phosphate foods with added phosphates. If you start to get to a point where you're retaining fluid, then you're also adjusting your fluid intake. So at the end of the day, there is no one diet for anyone, period, because as you know, we all have different food preferences, different food likes. We have different reasons for why we eat what we eat, food allergies, food intolerances, even the availability of food. As was mentioned, food insecurity is one of the areas that I do work in. And so availability of food is a big factor. And availability of food has to do with where you are in terms of physical location. So are you close to places that you can actually get fresh, natural, whole foods? Do you have enough financial resources to be able to afford food? What about your food skills, your shopping skills, or even just the availability of storage? Do you have, a working fridge and freezer? Do you have a stove? So all those are considerations to take into play. Culture for sure is big. Tradition is big. If you had to make a lifestyle change and you could not eat the foods that you liked or foods that were culturally relevant to you and that you love and enjoy as tradition, none of these diets would be very sustainable. And then for kidney disease, now you're adding in actually dealing with something that's a chronic condition. So you're adding another layer of complexity to it, which means if you're making changes that are not sustainable, very unlikely that someone will be able to stick to any diet long-term. And so progression of the disease will be fairly quick. All right, so general recommendations, which will work for all adults. Never food restriction. Again, food restriction leads to two things. One, undernourishment, or two, what we call binge restrict cycles. And so number two, saying binge or eat whatever, that is also a no. For some folks, what I found or what I'll hear is, well, something have to take me out this world. So I'm just gonna eat what I want. But our intent is to have like a good quality of life, right? And to live as long as we can and in a healthy way as we can. And so binging and eating whatever does not help that. In other instances, because we hear that we shouldn't eat this, we shouldn't eat that, some people can restrict because maybe a neighbor was told that they shouldn't eat something, right? But you're not sure if your neighbor has had their blood work done and their doctor or their dietitian told them to reduce certain foods because of their blood work. So you can't always even make changes based on a neighbor or another family member. You want to get your own individualized advice. So that restricting and then binging is very counterintuitive. It doesn't work for our healthy lifestyle goals. And so we know that, again, chronic illnesses can become overwhelming. It can become daunting. And so for some folks, using food as a coping mechanism, emotional eating can be a factor. And if you find that emotional eating is something, then I would encourage you to get support. Dietitians can also help in that regard. And so our overall aim is healthy, balanced diet. And what does that look like? It just means that we're having a variety of foods in our diet. Reason for that, there's no one food that has every single nutrient we need, right? So our goal is to stay as nourished as possible. We're not wasting, we're not having protein energy wasting, we're not having, we're not going to be at risk for nutrient deficiencies. We're having foods from all the food groups, and it is possible. So all the food groups will provide a variety of nutrients that you need. And so if we're looking at this example on my slide, the Caribbean food groups, the ones that we know and we love. So non-starchy vegetables, right? That's always going to be number one because most of your food intake should be non-starchy vegetables. Then you have your fruits, fish, shellfish, legumes like your dried peas and beans, so your plant-based proteins, your roots and your tubers, so your sweet potato, cassava, whole grains like your rice, your oats, starchy fruits like your plantain and your banana. Of course, you have calcium-rich foods, so plant-based milks or dairy, lean meats, fluids, healthy fats, and nuts and seeds. So specific nutrients of concern, I'll go over this briefly and then we'll get into actual meal planning. So the 4 nutrients that we tend to hear about when we hear about the kidney diet or eating for your kidneys, protein is a big one. For most of us, we actually tend to get way too much protein. And I had mentioned that protein is one of those nutrients, like with digestion, it does produce waste. So your kidneys is sometimes forced to work harder to get rid of excess protein or extra waste if we take in too much. But generally, as a nutrient, we need protein. So the solution is not to just completely avoid protein or not have any protein-rich foods, because we do need protein to build and repair our muscles. We use protein to make enzymes and hormones that maintain a whole host of different body functions. We use protein to build antibodies, which also plays a role in immunity, our hair, different cells, nails, skin. Protein plays such a huge role in our diet and in our bodies that the solution, like I mentioned, is not to completely restrict. So you neither want to be under or over, and you'll hear the term adequate protein intake. And I am going to say what adequate is in my next slides, because that can also be a confusing thing for some people. Like, what is adequate, right? Adequate can be a subjective word. Sodium plays a role. As we know, it plays a role in blood pressure management. And hypertension is also linked to declining kidney health. Sodium plays a role in nerves and muscle function, so it is a nutrient that we need. There's an established level called an adequate intake, and the adequate intake is that level of sodium intake where we need it for our body to function in the role that it does, and then it's above a certain level that it becomes too high. So we'll discuss that in further detail. Potassium also plays a role in blood pressure management, muscle function. Phosphorus plays a role in our bones. And then we know that fluid helps us to get rid of the waste in our body, but it has other functions, like helping us maintain and regulate body temperature. So if it's too hot, then we sweat, right? Fluid plays a role in cushioning our joints and, cushioning sensitive organs like our spine or spinal cord. So why we would need to limit these? Protein foods produces waste. So extra waste equals extra work for our kidneys. Sodium increases blood pressure. And because our kidneys also will filter excess salt, then we'll have excess salt building up, which can cause us to retain water. Potassium is also filtered in the kidney. And so a buildup of potassium can affect our heart. It can cause irregular heartbeat. And then too much phosphorus can actually cause our bones to get weak. Phosphorus can build up in the kidneys as well if our kidneys are not able to filter the excess. In terms of fluid intake, reduced urine output can lead to fluid overload. We end up with water retention, and that can also increase our blood pressure. So when we say adequate protein, what does that really mean? Just enough protein to make sure that our needs are met, enough protein which can help us do the work that it does, so repair tissues, help our muscles to repair, help us to build hormones, enzymes, antibodies. Without too much protein or without enough protein, we end up with wasting. So wasting, like you don't have enough muscle strength because you have muscle loss. That can affect your ability to get up, to walk. So where are our food sources of protein? Usually 2 types. You can get it in most foods. Some foods just have higher amounts than others, but our highest sources of protein would be our animal foods. So chicken, fish, beef, and then it gets into lower amounts. You start to get into like the eggs and the cheese, the dairy, the beans, the legumes. And so your general recommendation for making sure that you're getting just enough protein is not to fill your plate and to space your meals throughout the day. So there is something called the plate method. I'm sure you've heard it before, where you fill a quarter of your plate with a food from the group. So you would divide your plate into 4 and you're filling each quadrant of the plate with different food groups. If you've ever heard me speak, you would hear me talk about the plate method, because I think it's one of the simplest methods that people can use to help manage their portion sizes without overcomplicating things by counting numbers or counting calories or weighing foods or weighing their meals. So spread your protein throughout the day and only put it on 1/4 of your plate. Other tips include making sure that you're using lean methods of cooking or preparing your protein. So trimming fat wherever you can. And if you do need to cook, then you're cooking with if you're cooking with oil, then you're cooking with a healthy oil. If you're a vegetarian, always include plant-based proteins. So your beans, your peas. There was a question, I believe, around phosphorus and possibly only choosing to use white rice and white bread. Maybe Ken could remind me. And so the reasoning for that was around the phosphorus intake, and anything that's white and refined would have lower phosphorus levels than some of our whole grains. Fruits and vegetables as well tend to have higher levels of phosphorus, but we now know that the phosphorus from certain foods is not as bioavailable to your body, so it doesn't absorb as easily. And if that's the case, then we actually do not need to completely restrict those foods as long as our blood work stays normal. So I have this slide that I've added just to give you a quick snapshot of protein content of some common foods. And so if you look to your left, the average grams in this is a cooked amount of the food or prepared amount of the food is on your left. And so as I mentioned, like the beef, fish, chicken, pork, any animal food, lamb, goat, they tend to be higher in protein content. And so in that reason, if you're taking in those portions, you do want to make sure that you're mindful of the serving size. You're very mindful of sticking to either like a handful, so like a size of the palm of your hand, or 1/4 of the plate. I'll be sharing my slides as well. Ken could share it with anyone who's on the call who's interested. And so you'll have a copy of this.
Yeah, they'll be available.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk about meal planning. So again, now we know protein content and how would that look on our plate. 1/4 of your plate. I demonstrated this here. And then you'll fill the other half of your plate with the non-starchy vegetables, right? Or if it's breakfast time, maybe you might do a fruit, but you're filling this with, again, plant-based foods, non-starchy veggies. And then the other 1/4 of your plate, you're doing your starchy fruits, your roots, your tubers, your rice, bread. This method of eating also works for diabetes management and blood sugar management. And so it does play a role with the kidney factor, but then also from a diabetes management point of view. Now, I just want to take a minute and ask the group, you don't have to say anything out loud. You don't even have to share if you wanted to, but think about the dinner that you had last night or any meal that you ate yesterday and see how it compares to this. Did it have at least 3 or 4 food groups? Was it half of that meal vegetables? Did you have a smaller amount of protein and then a moderate amount of starch? And if not, think about what you could do for your next meal to make it better or to improve, to have it look similar to the plate method. That's one of the activities I usually tend to do, is to say, do a little bit of journaling, write down your intake for a day and look at where you could make improvement. Once you've done that, try to make a small change. So when you hear that you have, again, a chronic illness, diabetes, hypertension, kidney disease, anything where you need to make changes, sometimes it becomes so overwhelming that people end up feeling very defeatist and they don't even try. But you can do small steps, small changes. Pick one little thing and work on that thing, and then you keep building on, right? So small incremental changes. You make one change. If vegetables are not your thing, if you're not able to do half, start with 1/4 of your plate veggie, right? And then you keep building. So this is an example of a plate method makeover. On your left, the plate basically shows rice, and that could be naan or roti or a chapati, but some kind of flatbread. And then you have almost half the plate filled with your meat. So a makeover would be to take off some of that rice, some of the bread. It looks like 2 pieces of naan or 2 pieces of roti. And you add two servings of vegetables, right? It's not exactly half, but you've added 2 portions of vegetables onto your plate, and you have reduced some of the rice and reduced some of the bread or flat bread. Also notice that there's some reduced meat here. So this allows you to get the adequate protein or a moderate protein intake. And then when we say moderate carbohydrate, that's what a moderate carbohydrate looks like. So the volume of food is the same because the plate is filled just the same. But now you've adjusted the nutrients that you're getting on your plate, and you've also adjusted not to get into calories, but you've basically adjusted the caloric intake of the food intake. So you've adjusted overall nutrient value because you've added in a variety of nutrients. You've increased the fiber content from the fruits and from the vegetables. You've also reduced the amount of calories that you're taking in, which is beneficial for weight management. It's also beneficial for blood sugar management because you've reduced the amount of starch. But you'll still have the same feelings of fullness and satiety. You're not going to feel as if you're still hungry and like you need to go get more because the volume of food is the same. So some additional tips for choosing foods from the protein group. Choose things like mackerel, salmon, herring, but unsalted herring, right? Fresh mackerel, just because these foods are also a source of a healthy fat called omega-3. Like I mentioned, heart disease can be a risk factor. So omega-3 fat is a very beneficial nutrient for managing heart disease. Choose lean meats more often, trim the fat, and cook your meats in healthier ways. So stewing or baking, you can do a light stir fry. If you pour oil into a pan and it's spread all over the pan, immediately that's too much oil. You should have to take your pan. I don't have a pot to show, but you should have to swirl your pan to get the oil around. That's how you know it's just enough oil if you're cooking for a family or multiple servings. I definitely want to hit on the pickled, salted, dried, smoked fish type food. So the salt fish, pickled mackerel, salt beef, pig's tail, anything pickled, salted, canned corned beef, those will be extremely high in salt, right? Like that would be a processed or ultra processed type meat. And so that will have effects for blood pressure management. But if phosphates are added, then that's also could have a potential for added phosphate if you need to watch your phosphate intake. If you're using beans, preferably use dried peas and beans. We know the cooking process takes a while. But if you're cooking beans, if there's a day that you have time to do a good food prep, then you cook like a big pot of beans, and you can portion your beans and your peas into different portions and freeze them for when you're ready to make a soup or a stew or to add to your rice for rice and peas. If you do have to use canned beans, because I am mindful of, again, food insecurity or convenience because time is a factor, just make sure you rinse the beans very well, like rinse them 2-3 times. Don't use the liquid that it comes in. I know sometimes there's a practice to use the liquid that's in the can. You want to get rid of that, strain that off and put it into a colander and rinse your beans. And as much as possible, you're going to choose no sodium added food. So no sodium added canned fish, unsalted nuts, unsalted seeds. You do want to stay away from foods that taste salty, but they say no added salt because you want to make sure that you're not using a salt replacer or a salt substitute. So your adequate intake for sodium, 1,500 milligrams per day, up to a max of 2,000 milligrams per day. 1,500 is what your body needs to do the function, but for most people, it's impossible to get to that 15, or it just becomes overly restrictive to have to watch every single intake because sodium is present naturally in foods. Plus, of course, we know that salt adds flavor to food. So having a gradual reduction is more beneficial. So that 1,500 to 2,000 allows a more liberal approach. Try not to go above that amount. Above that is where you get into increased risk of affecting your your blood pressure. So true or false? If I had time, I would have done a poll, but just mentally, or if you want to use reactions, if you know how to use the reactions on your screen, true or false? Sea salt has less sodium than iodized table salt. So just take a minute, think about your answer, and then see if it matches with my answer. The answer is false. True or false? Another one. Kosher salt has less sodium than iodized table salt. And that answer is also false. So any of the sea salts, Himalayan salt and various salts, they actually do have similar amounts of sodium. So gram for gram, they will have the same amount. Some of the salts are a little bit more flavorful, which allows you to use less of it. So sea salt might have a stronger flavor that allows you to use less of it, but gram for gram, they do have the same amount of sodium. Another risk factor for some of our community and our cooking practices is the use of high salt seasonings. So using stock cubes or powdered seasonings that have salt added. So the all-purpose seasoning, the jerk seasoning, oxtail seasoning, fish seasoning, all those seasonings, I know the flavor is great, but they do have added salt and they do have a higher sodium content. And so sometimes when I'm with my individual assessment, I'll say, do you add salt? And the answer here is, no, I don't add any salt. But once I start to evaluate and get into, so tell me how you made that soup and how did you make the fish? And I start hearing about the stock cubes and, the all-purpose seasoning. And I say, go back home, take that food package or that spice jar and read the label. And they'll come back and say, yes, true, it has salt. So you want to watch out for high salt seasonings, cubes, broth, anything that has a label. Start to read the label to see where your food sources of salt are coming from. And I said this before, but because it's on the slide again, I'm going to do the caution. You want to stay away from salt substitutes. So anything that's called like half salt, read the label to make sure that there's no added potassium. Just want to play this clip. And I usually do a cooking demo pre-COVID that would be called how to add flavor without salt. Actually, quite a few years before COVID, we had a hypertension cooking program, and one of the sessions was around cooking without salt. Are you able to hear that sound?
Well, you just stopped it.
Okay, let me know how well, because I just realized I forgot to share sound.
No. No, we're not hearing it.
Okay, that's what I thought. Just give me a second. Usually it gives me an option to say share sound, but it's not doing that.
At the bottom it would say when you go to share, it would say share sound.
Yeah.
I am not sure. Because you are co-host, you should be able to see.
No, it didn't.
Oh.
Okay, so it's just a 2-minute clip, but I can review on the side. They were just giving different tips on different ways that you can add, and some of them I know are tips that we...
No, it's not.
No?
No.
Oh, I figured it out.
But the reason why is because salt can raise your blood pressure.
Some people wonder what exactly... Hi, I'm Chef Nikki Shaw, back with you again.
And I'm Dr. Gray. Glad to have you back with us.
Dr. Gray, what can you tell us about the importance of using less salt?
Doctor may have told you to cut back on the salt. I know this might be hard, but the reason why is because salt can raise your blood pressure.
Some people wonder what exactly is hypertension or high blood pressure.
Basically, Nikki, hypertension or high blood pressure is that the heart has to work extra hard to pump blood.
Okay, and some people say that they can't stand their food without salt.
You don't have to cut out salt all at once. Start slowly. And after a time, your taste buds won't know the difference.
And you know what? You don't have to lose flavor when you lose the salt.
Nikki, what do you like to use instead of salt?
Oh, I like to cook with fresh herbs and dried herbs. I also love to use onion powder, garlic powder, and I really like to squeeze fresh lemon juice all over my vegetables and on fish, and I use it in soups. If you try all these other flavors, I guarantee you will not miss the salt.
People barbecue on the weekend, myself included. But barbecue sauce has a lot of salt in it. What advice do you have for us grillers out there?
Well, you can try the sauce on the side. That way you're not using so much sauce on your meat. Or you can do a delicious dry rub with allspice and thyme and onion. Or you can try like a marinade with olive oil and garlic and pepper, which is great on chicken and turkey burgers.
Many other condiments, like ketchup and salad dressing, contain a lot of salt. What are some other options?
Well, I make my own salad dressing with olive oil, fresh lemon or lime juice, and a little bit of honey. I also like to make salsas with roasted red peppers and tomatoes and maybe a little olive oil and pepper. And if I'm using canned beans or vegetables, I always rinse them to get rid of any extra salt.
I'm getting hungry. Thank you, Chef Nikki. This is inspiration big time. Cutting out the salt, but still keeping the flavor.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you got some great ideas. We'll see you next time.
The one that I want to highlight is the gradual reduction, because your taste buds will really get used to gradual reduction. It's the thing that most food manufacturers actually use. They do a little bit of a reduction at a time. So sometimes, let's say bread from a few years ago would actually have less bread and even less salt and even less sugar than the breads contain these days. And most of us did not even realize, because they did gradual reduction. They would do 10%, 10%. And so I always recommend doing a quick measurement, or just seeing like how many dashes of something you add. Even if you're not a measuring person, like did you add 3 dash, 4 dash, when you're shaking that thing, how many times are you shaking? And start to see, can I add half? Can I add less? And adjust the taste. It can be challenging if you're cooking for a family, multi-generational homes, where you're trying to adjust and manage your condition. Pardon?
No, go ahead.
Okay, you're trying to manage your condition, but then you're also cooking for other people that might have their own food preferences or taste preferences. So do the gradual cutback and get everybody in the household on the same page, because it is not nice to have to cook multiple meals, right? You want to be able to cook for one family. Add flavor without salt by using like fresh herbs and spices. And you'll see on the next slide, I've provided like a jerk seasoning recipe that I made, or we've been sharing and using a Taibu over the years. It gives 9% daily value. I'll cover what daily value looks like, but it's a measure of how little or how much of a nutrient is in a serving of the food. So in this jerk seasoning that the recipe is here, the only source of salt is actually coming from a low sodium soy sauce. But I'm sure over time you could start to even reduce that soy sauce, because everything else gives so much flavor. The Scotch bonnet pepper, your garlic, your onion, right? Allspice, vinegar, a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of nutmeg, and some people say cinnamon, nutmeg, but if you actually buy the commercial jar jerk seasonings and read the ingredient label line by line, you'll actually see that they do use a little bit of those flavors in their own jerk sauce. And if you were to compare it to one of this well-known jerk seasoning, this has 23% daily value compared to the homemade one, which is 9% daily value. I've also given a seasoning rub that you can use on like chicken, pork. You can use it on beef or any meats. And this is from a Dietitian's of Canada cookbook called Simply Good Food. Again, I'm sharing the slides so you'll have access to this, but you can do your own rubs at home, like go to Bulk Barn and buy a bunch of different spice mix them together and keep them in a jar. Here's another all-purpose seasoning, again using dried herbs and ground garlic, ground onion. So I'm going to jump quickly to potassium, another true or false question. I need to stop eating fruits and veggies because they have potassium. I really like ripe bananas and other fruits, and now I can't eat these anymore. I know I can't eat these anymore because I'm hearing that I have CKD or chronic kidney disease. Your answer will be false because, again, it's individualized. Unless a doctor or dietitian has reviewed blood work, you've had updated blood work, which you should be getting twice a year, and they've told you not to, or to reduce your intake, you can actually continue to eat fruits and veggies as you want within general recommendations. So 3 fruits spaced throughout the day would be totally adequate. And then having half your plate filled with vegetables would also be adequate. If you get to the point where you do need to start restricting your potassium intake, you can request a list of your high potassium and low potassium foods. And that will actually show you which fruits, vegetables, which foods have your higher potassium amounts and how you can balance them. This is where it does become important to work with a dietitian who can help you plan out your diet. So potassium is naturally occurring, right? It's naturally occurring in a lot of different foods. And if you were to restrict everything, it could become a barrier. It could affect your digestive health because some of the potassium-rich foods are also sources of fiber. You don't need to restrict it as much because, again, they're not as absorbed as added potassium additives, and the same with phosphate additives. I'm mindful of the time, so I may skip some of these. Again, you can request a list of different foods. If you do need to restrict your potassium, these are some examples of some common foods, fruits and vegetables that are on the lower potassium scale. So like your tangerine, your oranges, your apples, pineapple, and like a whole bunch of different vegetables, carrots, okra, cauliflower, chocho. All these are low potassium examples. Again, same with phosphate. You don't need to avoid naturally occurring phosphate. So traditionally, or traditional kidney diets from way back when, even I'm pretty sure when I was just a new grad or doing my 1 or 2 placements at UHN at their renal clinic, the advice would be to use like rice cake and white bread and white rice. The naturally occurring form is very poorly absorbed in comparison to the added phosphate. And so I've given an example here of a food label where you can read your ingredient list to see if you see the word phosphate. If you see the word phosphate, then that would be a phosphate additive, and those foods you would want to limit or avoid. Fluid, definitely unrestricted unless you start to have symptoms. There was a question around, too much urination or not, and Dr. Natu explained it quite well by saying you're more likely to actually retain and not have urine output. So if you ever get to the stage where you start to notice swelling in your feet, you want to follow up with your provider right away. If you start to notice that you're going the entire day and you haven't peed, you're out on the road, but you're drinking water, and you didn't even feel the urge or the need to go pee, then you do want to follow up with your provider to see if you're having any fluid retention. When we talk about fluid, I just want to give some examples that it's not just water, right? So teas, coffee, soups, fruits and vegetables, especially like high volume ones like your watermelon or your cucumbers, those are also a source of water, source of fluid. So if you do get to the point where you need to restrict your fluid intake, then you do want to see a dietitian who can actually review all the different sources of fluids to help you manage your intake. Fiber is a big consideration. For some folks, if they do need to get to the point of restriction, fiber or limited fiber can affect constipation. Some medications for managing chronic conditions can also cause constipation. If you start to restrict your fluid intake, it can affect constipation. So this is one of those conditions that you can be mindful of. That's sometimes a side effect of the medications or having to make dietary restrictions. And this is why, for me, it's important to say we can't blanketly say no fruits, no vegetables, or I can't eat certain things, because you're really trying to manage every stage and every single factor of an individual's life. I'll touch on supplements very quickly. And my general rule of thumb here is that general multivitamin mineral supplements are not recommended if you have CKD. It's better for you to do an individualized approach again. So having either a recommendation based on a full assessment of what your needs are, and then if you do need to take a vitamin, say vitamin D, then you're taking the vitamin D by itself. You're not taking vitamin D that's in a multivitamin formula. Some supplements for sure, high doses of it, we do not recommend because they can build up. So vitamin A, E, and K, they're fat-soluble vitamins. Your body tends to store those. And so high levels of vitamin A, E, and K are not recommended. High dose B vitamins and high dose C vitamins are also not recommended. So again, not enough research to support any general safe recommendation between the stage 1 to 5 CKD. And so individual nutrients and individual assessment is recommended if you need it. If you have to eat out, this is a big one. Again, this is all about lifestyle changes and how to make sure that people are able to sustain and maintain, because it can affect quality of life. If all your family and friends are going out, or you have to go to somebody's house and everybody's having a barbecue, get together, special occasions, you know, and you feeling as if you're not able to participate, it can affect quality of life, mental health. And so I do like to provide tips for eating out. So one is planning ahead. If you know already that you're going to be at somebody's house or you're going out for a birthday celebration, you start to watch for sure your food intake that day. So you're limiting any other foods that are high in sodium in your meals throughout the day. You're also watching your portion sizes and making sure that you're following that plate method throughout the day. If you're at a restaurant or somebody's house, try to choose places where you can modify menus. And so this would include restaurants where things are prepared to order. So you can actually say, do not add salt, right? Hold the salt. You can tell them not to add salad dressings or soy sauce or, you know, ketchup, any of those condiments. If you're going to a restaurant where the food is pre-prepared, you're less likely to make an adjustment. If you do happen to be at a restaurant where the foods are pre-prepared, try to choose foods that have been cooked in healthier ways. So stir-fry dishes or foods that actually include some kind of vegetables, or the option to add side steamed veggies or side salads. If it seems to be a very heavy meat dish, then you're asking for half portions. So way in advance, you're asking them for a takeout container right away, so you can divide your portions into half, so you're not tempted to finish and clean your plate. So adding vegetables and then cutting meat portions in half. One example would be if you're out and you tend to do a 10, 12 ounce steak, then you're choosing the meal with a 6 ounce or less. I'll touch on label reading quickly just because I wanted to focus on the percentage DV. So sodium listed on the label, on this label it's saying 0%, but generally any number that's above 15% on the label, so I'll go back. These numbers on the side, they're called your percentage DV, and sodium is usually listed with that percentage DV. It's DV or daily value. So the sodium percentage is based on that 2,400 milligrams that I mentioned earlier. And anything above 15% would be a lot, but it's in that food and it's per serving of the food. So you always start to look at the serving of the food and compare that with the amount you're actually taking in. So on this example, this is per 1 cup serving. If you had a half cup serving, and let's pretend sodium here was 100, then you would be taking in half of that 100. So you always compare to the amount that you're consuming. I'll pause here for questions, comments, feedback.
There are quite a few questions in the chat. So.
Okay. I might have to do a follow-up if we get into. All right, I can't see, so I'll just listen for what you're saying.
Okay, so let me go through them and some of them very quickly. Which oils are considered to be healthy oils?
So oils that tend to have monounsaturated fats. So an example of that would be olive oil, right? Olive oil, avocado oil. Those are all healthier fats.
Someone loved their inclusion of rice and peas.
Oh, great. Try to make it culturally relevant, of course, because those are the questions I would have.
Yeah. So how can Black or Caribbean African chefs be persuaded to use less salt in their dishes?
You know what? Feedback. If you go to the restaurants, if that's somewhere that you frequent often, give them feedback, right? The more feedback they get, I feel like they'll change. If nobody says anything, then there is no incentive to change. So we have to really give them written comments and written feedback. And I'm liking this question because I didn't want to name a specific type of cuisine, but that would be an example of a restaurant where you're less likely to go and have the option to prepare something fresh, right? I think most restaurants, one thing that they may prepare to order would be something like fish. And I guess because of the cost of fish, they're not going to prep fish and have it sitting. So fish is one option if you feel like you need to order out. And if you feel like going to a Caribbean restaurant, for example, that's one that you could order and tell them less salt. But otherwise, I would say feedback, because most of the other dishes are always I'm having difficulty with that word today, but pre-prepared, waiting for you.
Okay, what are the physical symptoms of low potassium?
I'm gonna leave that for the nurse practitioner. I just know what the values are and then how to increase it.
Okay. I don't know if Paulette is still on and would like to answer that. Maybe she's not.
Because usually I don't get folks with low potassium. I know what the values are, but I don't think I've ever been referred to somebody with a potassium below 3.5. They're usually like, if they're over 5.5, I guess because of the risk of, so anything with like elevated potassium can lead to, I mentioned heart irregularities, but I didn't actually say that your heart could stop. And that's really the worst outcome. And so because of that, I guess doctors and nurse practitioners are more deliberate with referring somebody if they have the elevated potassium. So I'm sorry, I just can't answer the low potassium one.
Yeah, with the highest Paulette. I don't often see patients with low potassium either. If they do have low potassium, it's easily corrected because most of the time our patients are limited in the foods that they can eat. So we'll just tell them to have an extra banana. But usually I don't know if Dr. Nathu is still on the line, but I'm not too familiar with the symptoms. I'm more familiar with the symptoms of high potassium.
Because sometimes that low potassium could be with the person ill, like were they vomiting, right? Like did they lose electrolytes? And that could be more easily corrected. I don't know. That's why I didn't see. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So with low potassium, they may just feel a little weak. They may have muscle weakness or otherwise just be totally asymptomatic.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Nathu. The next question is, how good is red wine in managing health generally, and what effect does this have on diabetic and high blood pressure?
I like that question too. I have my thoughts on it. I'm gonna skip to the alcohol slide. That was, I did have a few more slides. I just had to do my stuff in terms of time and I wasn't sure where I would get to, but I had a slide on this. So red wine has antioxidants, and the antioxidants that it has, anthocyanins, it's linked to heart health, right? It's a part of the Mediterranean diet, which I'm going to call it an evidence-based diet. It's not necessarily a gold standard diet. It's a diet that's like been heavily studied. So the more research behind something, they can actually make more general recommendations. And so it would be considered best evidence, but not the only evidence, because a lot of our cultural foods would also fit the criteria for what would be considered a Mediterranean diet. So when I use the word Medi diet or Mediterranean diet, I'm not saying that that's the one that we need to go follow. It's just the one that has a lot of evidence and research behind it. And so red wine is listed in one of those. It's also part of a diet called the MIND diet, which is basically linking cognitive function. But my thoughts on alcohol generally is not to overdo it, to stick within recommendations. So for women, maximum 1 drink per day, and men, maximum 2 drinks per day. But even then, I also feel that can be too much, because there is links between cancer and alcohol intake, and also alcohol and high blood pressure. So for me, it's just not to overdo it, and just do it only if you feel like it. I wouldn't say to start drinking red wine if you are not already drinking red wine. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah. What is your opinion of organic versus regular foods?
So organic is just mainly related to the type of farming. So organic, you're growing foods without certain additives, right? Certain pesticides, versus conventional farming that might have those kind of compounds. It doesn't actually affect the nutritional value of the food. So when they do nutrition analysis of the food, I'm just going to come out my screen for a little bit. When they do nutrition analysis of the food, of organic versus conventional farming, the actual nutrient per nutrient is actually the same.
Okay. You mentioned non-starchy vegetables a lot. What are the examples of starchy vegetables?
So starchy vegetables would be what we call, if you're Caribbean, you're calling that food provision. So yam, sweet potato, potato in general, like your Irish potato, all the different types of yams, cassava, roots and tubers generally, right? Anything under the ground except for carrots would be a good way of saying what's going to be high starch. And that would go on the portion of the plate that has like your rice. It's a quarter of your plate. So, so for example, a meal like soup where you're going to have like your yam, banana, breadfruits, all of those in it. Those are all starchy foods. I encourage people to either cut them really small or make your dumpling really small. If you're boiling a pot to go with, let's say, your fish, you're making those very small, not big dumplings, because then you're going to be tempted to fill your plate with a lot of those.
What is your opinion of taking Metamucil every day for fiber?
So a fiber supplement is helpful. From a kidney perspective, though, I don't know what it contains in terms of other additives. And so I would need to read the label, or you would need to read the label, because some of the supplements can have potassium additives. So, for example, Metamucil has like a sweetener to it. I'm not really sure what it includes. So I couldn't answer specifically from a kidney health perspective.
Right. The next question, I think you have addressed it. Someone says, how does what we call ground provisions fit into the starchy diet? You did
I mean, I could address it again, but you put it on the side of your plate where you would put rice. I'll give this tip because I've seen it come up a few times in my one-to-one encounters when I tell you folks, you're going to add non-starchy vegetables to your diet. And they'll say, like, for example, what? And I said, well, steamed cabbage, for example, or you're adding okra, you're doing a salad, any vegetable that you like that fits into the non-starch category is what you're going to add. And then I'll hear, well, I made ackee and saltfish, and then I had boiled banana and dumpling. And I did steamed cabbage or kalaloo. So I said, but then show it to me on your plate. And I said, no, I had the cabbage on the side. So there's a side plate with the cabbage, and then the plate still has, the banana, the yam, and all that. That to me is what I would not recommend, because you're still overdoing it. Any vegetables would be still on your plate. And so that allows you to take in, let's say, the boiled banana if you liked it, and the dumpling, but you're not overdoing it on the content, because you've also added in some other vegetables on the same plate.
Yeah, just have two last questions. Would low vitamin D levels lead to kidney disease?
I'm going to leave that to the doctor as well. I don't have any.
No.
I don't think so.
No, it doesn't. Okay. And the last question is cooked versus uncooked vegetables. Which is better?
I'm going to say it depends. If you've been told that your potassium levels are high and you need to take it down, then you can double boil certain foods, right? Or you can cook those vegetables in a little bit more water so that you get rid of some of the potassium. Doesn't get rid of all of it, but you get rid of some of the potassium. But if you don't have to watch your potassium levels, if you're on an unrestricted diet, you're just doing healthy eating pattern, raw or cooked is really your preference. I just also prefer not overcooking vegetables, because you do get to retain a lot of the other nutrients.
But Tameika, in our clinic, the dietitians do recommend double boiling a lot, especially for potatoes, restricting some of the provision like bananas, green bananas. You can double boil them, or the other is to soak them overnight, throw off that water, and then continue cooking, but also limiting.
Right. So I agree. And I'm saying the same thing, Paulette. So I'm saying if you don't need to restrict your potassium, then that's not really a concern. And in my case, remember, I'm seeing people without dialysis or who are not on dialysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, Tameika, I really want to thank you very much. This was a really excellent presentation. A lot of information.
Thank you.